Tonight, we're honored to have poet, essayist, and storyteller Thomas P. Lynch as featured reader in the Crazy Wisdom Poetry Series. During 3 decades of attending to his family's undertaking business, he's fashioned graceful, witty, and sometimes gut-wrenching poems, memoirs, and fictions. This unusual vantage point somehow enables him to observe the entire life cycle and transform gritty human experiences into life-affirming events. Highlights of Tom's special publication record, splendid publication record, include The Undertaking, Life Studies from the Dismal Trade. It was a national bestseller, which won the American Book Award. Apparitions and Late Fictions, a novella and stories, explores themes of love and death, which are also found in the poems. The Depositions, new and selected essays, published in 2020, gathers the best of his nonfiction prose, first published in the New York Times, London Times, Harper's, and in his earlier books. Finally, Bone Rosary, new and selected poems, published by David R. Godine in 2021, is his most recently published book. Bone Rosary is a long-awaited selection of poems from the author's 5 previous books of poems. It contains 43 new poems. The new poems alone could have been enough for a standalone collection. The poet's Catholic faith and dual residence in Milford, Michigan, and County Clare, Ireland, are evident in many of the poems. The author is as candid about his impulses and weaknesses as any of the confessional school of poets. Some poems' diction reflects the storytelling conventions of ancient Irish oral poetry. I'm also amazed by the uncanny skill with which these poems rely on variations of the iambic pentameter line, while still sounding like the latest news. The introduction to Bone Rosary explains the circuitous way Thomas Lynch decided to give his selected poems that title. Perhaps he'll tell us something about that. Please welcome Thomas Lynch.
Thanks, Ed. There's very little mystery to what a bone rosary is, but you're not alone in wondering what it might be. Long ago, I started giving my dog soup bones every morning as a way of, giving me some time and then some time to meditate on the day that was in it. And of course, these bones would litter the lawn up here at the lake. I'd worry about them getting shot through the window by a lawnmower or things like that. So I'd send the grandkids around to pick them up and bring them to me. If I was out there, I'd find some. And I started stringing them on a rope. And it was actually Matthew Sweeney was here in 2016, his last visit to North America. And he was staying here for 3 weeks or so. And I was looping together another decade of this bony rope. And he said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a bone rosary." Well, I made that up because I like the sound of the O's in it. And because as a devoutly lapsed Catholic, I knew that he would understand the notion of the sort of beaded abacus sense of a rosary. And it had become very, very truly, it had become a way of keeping track of time for me. This became more so the case after Bill died, and I got another version of the same dog. His name is Carl. Carl likes bones just as much as Bill did. So I hung these ropes of bones from a fulcrum that overhangs the lake up here. And it occurred to me, and I told this to Matthew, that people who would go by in a boat and look at that, they would think to themselves, whoever that is, he's not to be tampered with because he may not be well. And so far it's working I've not been invaded or anything. I get very little company up here. One of the things that has been a real blessing is that some years ago, because the only ones that would live with me that weighed more than 100 pounds was the dogs. I hired an assistant to travel with. She's the niece of neighbors of mine up here who said that she'd be really good for the job. She's bookish and learned and argumentative. All these things are pluses as far as I'm concerned. And there's 40 years difference in our age, which has some disadvantages, but it's worked out pretty well. She's done all my grocery shopping through the pandemic and comes by here 2 or 3 days a week to bedevil me with news of what's going on in the outer world. And so this is a poem, one of the new poems from this Bone Rosary, one of several that have to do with conversations or times I've spent with this person. Corinne is her name. And it's part of a collection in this, at the end of these selected poems, called Cloud of Witnesses. And these bones really do strike me as a way of sort of channeling the losses and the spiritual world that has become more populated during the pandemic. And I think as I'm instructed through one of the fellowships, I take seriously that the spiritual life is not a theory, we have to live it. And that Bone Rosary, which I think my daughter-in-law, Andrea, was the one who wrapped it in solar lights, blue ones, and they blink on and off at night, particularly after sunny days. So anybody that ever thought of invading my premises probably has given up any hope of doing that. This is called Careen Among the Fronds of Basil. I'm told whenever I'm in the UK that it's basil. But Careen was here today and she says, it's basil, you come from Michigan. So it's Careen Among the Fronds of Basil. The leafy basil from the garden fills the kitchen with a whiff of summer's losses and frames the figure of a prepossessing girl among these fronds saved from the coming frost. She adds pine nuts and olive oil, shredded Parmesan, fine crushed bulbs of garlic pressed into a greeny pesto, boils pasta, as if the sky weren't actually falling. Hell and high water in one dire week, the bottoms falling out of everything, 200,000 dead of pestilence. My long lost daughter Heather, lost for keeps, halfway through a leap year, taking her leap into the beckoning embrace of the abyss. Desperate for good riddance, cold release, we got her home, alas, to let her go again. And good John Lewis gone to his reward, who stood upright on Black Lives Matter Plaza. No justice, no peace, our marching anthem. To see him crossing Edmund Pettus Bridge, bludgeoned, horizontal and victorious. And word will come tonight of RBG, notorious for justice and dissent, equality of genders, loves, and sexes, against all poverties and contagions. Corinne upholds these end of summer leaves with gratitude against begrudgeries. So that was written in September of 2020. And it was the last poem written that made it into this new and selected collection of poems. And so I always like starting with that because it sort of starts where the poems ended for this collection. It also, I must say, was the first time I wrote about my daughter's death by suicide in July of 2020. And I did it I did it because it worked into that poem very well, and also because for years I had been telling people to write about the thing they feared the most. And I thought if I write this and say it aloud and the sky doesn't fall on me, all four edges of it, that it would give me at least a toe in the door of recovering or managing or living through that experience. And I have to say it has. I have to say that were it not for poetry and friends who are poets, I probably wouldn't have managed nearly as well. The first book I published, and I thought what I'd do is maybe read the title poem from the 5 books I published before Bone Rosary, and then maybe read a new poem that's not in any book, or 2 or 3, depending on the time. The first book I published was called Skating with Heather Grace, and it was published in 1987. Gordon Lynch was the editor, and he chose this poem as the title poem. And I do love to read it. Skating with Heather Grace. Apart from the apparent values, there are lessons in the circular. Paradigms for history, time and around world turning, love with another of your species. To watch my only daughter widening her circles is to ease headlong into the traffic of her upbringing. Until nearly 4, she screamed at my absence, mourned my going out for any reason, cried at scoldings, agreed to common lies regarding thunder, Christmas, baby teeth. Last year, she started school without incident. This year, ballet and new math. Soon, I think, my love will seem entirely deficient. Later, there's the hokey pokey and dim lights for the partners' dance. She finds a shaky 9-year-old to skate around in counterclockwise orbits, laughing. Is it more willingness than balance? Is letting go the thing that keeps her steady? I lean against the sideboards, sipping coffee. I keep a smile ready. So after publishing that book in '87, I apparently wasn't disabused of the impulse to keep writing poems. It really was more encouragement than I should have been allowed. I could go to the library and find the book. I always just wanted a book to be on the shelf that would explain to my children what I was doing when I should have been paying attention to them. I think one of them once said, "You always seem to be looking at our ears." Well, it was because I was always sort of preoccupied with something that was going on in my head about a line or an image or a metaphor or something like that. I think I was listening closely, but maybe not. I wrote a second book of poems, which was published first in the UK. Robin Robertson, himself a great poet, and at that time editor at Jonathan Cape, published a book called Grimalkin, which was a poem about a fat, old, lazy she-cat. I've always had a fascination with lexicons and dictionaries and odd words, and I often got as a gift for Christmas one of those calendars with a new word on it every day. And one day in February of I don't know, in the 1990s, I got this word grimalkin, which is a Shakespearean term for a fat, old, lazy she-cat. And I was at the time occupying a house after divorcing my first wife. She left the kids and the cat pretty much with me, and I was glad the kids were there, but I hated the cat, and I was fairly certain the cat was trying to kill me. And so as anyone knows, you can't ever say anything bad about a former spouse, but that doesn't hold true of cats. So I figured if I could take all the bile and rancor that I had developed and spend it on a poem about this cat, it might kill the cat outright, all to the good, I thought. Anyway, this is called a grimalkin. One of these days she will lie there and be dead. I'll take her out back in a garbage bag and bury her among my son's canaries, the ill-fated turtles, a pair of angelfish, the tragic and mannerly household pests that had the better sense to take their leaves before their welcomes or my patience had worn thin. For 12 long years I've suffered this damn cat, while Mike, my darling middle son, himself, 12 years this coming May, has grown into the tender, if quick-tempered man-child his breeding blessed and cursed him to become. And only his affection keeps the cat alive, though more than once I've threatened violence, the brick and burlap in the river recompense for mounds of fur balls littering the house, choking the vacuum cleaner, or what's worse, shit in the closets, piss in the planters, mice that winter indoors safely as she sleeps, curled about a table leg, vigilant as any knickknack in a partial coma. But Mike, of course, is blind to all of it. The gray Angora breed of arrogance, the sluttish roar, the way she disappears for days, sex desperate once or twice a year, urgently ripping her way out the screen door to have her way with anything that moves, while Mike sits up with tuna fish and worry, crying into the darkness, "Here, kitty, kitty," mindless of her whorish treacheries, or of her crimes against upholsteries, the love seats, wingbacks, sofas, easy chairs she's puked and mauled into dilapidation. I have this reoccurring dream of driving her deep into the desert east of town and dumping her out there with a few days' feed and water. In the dream, she's always found by kindly tribes people who eat her kind on certain holy days as a form of penance. God knows I don't know what he sees in her. Sometimes he holds her like a child in his arms, rubbing her underside until she sounds like one of those battery-powered vibrators folks claim to use for the ache in their shoulders. And under Mike's protection, she will fix her indolent green-eyed gaze on me as if to say, "What are you gonna do about it, slick? The child loves me, and you love the child." Truth told, I really ought to have her fixed in the old way with an airtight alibi, a bag of ready mix, and no eyewitnesses. But one of these days she will lie there and be dead. And choking back loud hallelujahs, I'll pretend a brief bereavement for my Michael's sake, letting him think, as he has often said, deep down inside, you really love her, don't you, Dad? I'll even hold some cheerful obsequies, careful to observe God's never-failing care for even these, the least of his creatures, making some mention of a cat heaven where cat, ashes to ashes, cat, dust to dust, and the Lord gives and the Lord has taken away, thus claiming my innocence to the end. I'll turn Mike homeward from that wicked little grave, and if he asks, we'll get another one, because All boys need practice in the arts of love, and all their aging fathers in the arts of rage. So I can't help but think that cat lived to be 21 years old. So I did my part, you'd have to say, you know. Mike is, he's in his late 40s now. God bless him. And we don't feel the time going. That's the mystery of it anyway. I owe to Richard Tillinghast, whom I had met through the good offices of Keith Taylor and Alice Fulton and this bunch of people that lived in Ann Arbor who invited me to join their little workshop, you know, their poetry workshop. And this was a new idea for me because I had never been in a poetry workshop and didn't know how they just said, well, bring some poems. I said, oh, I can do that. So anyway, Richard and I became very good friends. We went fishing together a lot. I think I'm not sure if I was still drinking in those days or not, but we had Richard, all those people in that poetry group remain close friends. And at Bear River every year, I room with Richard in a little cabin down by Walloon Lake, and we have a poker game with some of the attendees, all of whom have no compunctions about removing our money from us, which is okay. It's as it should be. But anyway, Richard once came up with a plot to publish a little anthology called At the Gallery, and he commissioned all of his pals who didn't want to be paid for anything they did to write poems about a piece of art in the University of Michigan Museum of Art. Many of you have probably been into it and seen what a gorgeous collection they have there. It's gone from strength to strength over the years. And so I was given a catalog. Actually, my brother-in-law, who worked for the university in the art department, gave me a catalog for the university's collection. And one of the things I found in there straight away was a painting called Still Life in Milford by Lester Johnson. And I thought, I had buried a lot of the Johnson brothers in Milford, Michigan, and I thought, maybe it's a cousin of theirs or a distant relation. And so I went over to Ann Arbor to see the thing in the flesh, and I remember going in and saying, I'd like to see Still Life in Milford by Lester Johnson. And the woman looked into the catalog or looked into her computer and said, oh, that's in our permanent collection, which became sort of museumese, for it's in the basement. Nobody likes it that much. We haven't had it on the wall forever. It's never going to come up here. And not knowing that, I just said, well, show it to me. I'll have a look. I'll be gone. I'll be out of your way. Well, bless them, they did. They brought it upstairs from the dusty mausoleum that it had theretofore inhabited. Seems that one of the university presidents, Shapiro, I think, had been given this when he taught at Yale or someplace. And Mrs. Shapiro, when she came to Ann Arbor, said, not in my house. And she organized a gift to the museum, and I'm sure wrote it off at tax time. But whatever the case is, it belonged, I suppose, in the basement of their permanent collection. The book that I published using this as the title poem, I had the little image on the front cover. So that's probably as much airing as it's had in its lifetime. I think there might be 36 people who have seen it, you know, or read it. Anyway, and Lester Johnson turned out to be a fellow who taught art at the university back east. Anyway, Still Life in Milford, Oil on Canvas by Lester Johnson. In many ways, this is just kind of a love poem to Ann Arbor, because living about 40 minutes away, I thought, you know, I really loved going over to Ann Arbor and seeing bookish people and talking about poetry. and art and hearing music that never made it to Milford. You're lucky to live in a town like this with art museums and Indian food and movie houses showing foreign films and grad students and comely undergrads. Years back, I'd often make the half-hour trip. It was good for my creative juices to browse the holy books at Shaman Drum. Still, life in Milford isn't all that bad. We have 2 trendy restaurants and a bar well known by locals for its coney dogs. We have a bookshop now. We even have a rush hour, art fairs, and bon vivants, and a classic car show every October. Mostly muscle cars, Dodges, Chevys, and Fords. No psychic healers yet or homeopaths. Still, life in Milford has a certain ambiance. More Wyeth than Picasso, to be sure. More meatloaf and potatoes than dim sum. Fact is, at first I thought this Lester Johnson was a shirt-tail cousin of the Johnson brothers, long-standing members of the Chamber of Commerce in Milford, Michigan, like me. In fact, his only connection to these parts was still life in Milford, gathering dust here in the basement of the art museum. His own Milford somewhere back east, near Yale, the day job teaching he could never quit, the way that Robert Frost taught English here, and Donald Hall before the Muse and them escaped their offices in Angel Hall. They were last seen running and maybe running still. Life in Milford, Michigan is similar. I have steady work, a circle of friends, and lunch on Thursdays with the Rotary. I have a wife unspeakably beautiful, a daughter and 3 sons, a cat, a car, good credit, taxes and mortgage payments, and certain duties here, notably when folks get horizontal, breathless, still life in Milford ends, they call, I send a car. Between the obsequies, I play with words. I count the sounds and syllables and rhymes. I try to give it shape and sense like so. 8 stanzas of 8 lines apiece, let's say, 10 syllables per line, or 12, just words. And if rhyming's out of fashion, I fashion rhymes that keep their distance, 4 lines apart, like so. Still, life in Milford keeps repeating. Say, I'm just like Lester, just like Frost and Hall. I covet the moment in which nothing moves and crave the life free of life's distractions. A bucket of flowers on a table, a vase to arrange the flowers in, a small pipe, is it, smoldering in an ashtray to suggest the artist and impending action. Still life in Milford seems a parable on the human hunger for creation. The flowers move from bucket to vase like moving words at random into song. The act of ordering is all the same. The ordinary becomes a celebration, whether paper, canvas, ink, or oil paints. Once finished, we achieve a piece we call Still Life in Milford. Then we sign our names. I haven't read that in years. I really like it. I really like that sort of sleight of hand where you tell them what you're doing in the, 8 stanzas of 8 lines a piece. Let's say, too cute by half, but still, I really do like it. So I won't read the longish title poem for Walking Papers, which I think got published in 2010. It goes on for a bit, and it is walking. Ed was kind enough to mention my fascination with iambics and lines that fall in that sort of 10 to 12 syllable length. It's because I've tried to maintain a habit of walking, and your heart and your footfall replicate most often a kind of iambic code, that da-dum, 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 and you're breathing at the same time. I remember reading once in a very esoteric review, the math of all this comes out in such a way that it replicates that the iambic pentameter replicates our metabolism in a way that makes it not only memorable but memorizable. Maybe that's my connection to it. I wrote the poem after a conversation on the phone with the poet Michael Heffernan, without whom I wouldn't have written any poems. He was the first living poet I ever met. And I would encourage you to Google Michael Heffernan, Hefffernan. He is as internationally ignored as the rest of us are. So the chances of you having one of his books are remote. The chances of one of them being in the library is pretty good. He's published, I don't know, 8 or 10 books of poetry. Like many of us, he is suffering the indignities of age in ways that make his constant correspondence in sonnets and villanelles, it's not happening as much as it used to. I was just out to see him for his 80th birthday, and he's in good form. I love him dearly. I hope he makes the 100. I wish I could read this longish poem, but I think I'll just move along. Soon after actually publishing Walking Papers, I published a book of Sin Eater poems. And these, I'd always been writing Sin Eater poems because I discovered by watching a made-for-TV movie called The Master of Ballantrae. I had read about Sin Eaters in a book that my father had called The History of American Funeral Directing. And on the off chance that you won't find a copy in your library, I can tell you that it mentioned that Sin Eaters were people who in past times, and mostly in the British Isles, would come to the scene of a wake or where the corpse was laid out, and by taking unto himself the loaf of bread that was placed on the body of the dead, and drinking a bowl of beer that had been placed beside it, he could take unto himself the perdition, the punishment owing to the whatever sins had not been fully confessed or reconciled. This is sort of a working man's version of substitutionary atonement, a thing which Christianity is based upon, the notion that a blood sacrifice is required to compensate for our sinfulness. Christopher Hitchens, among others, have pointed out that that's kind of nonsense, but there it stands. I noticed, because I spend a lot of time in church, mostly with corpses. I'm otherwise fairly lapsed, but I've noticed that they're moving away from this sort of vicarious redemption atonement model, and are moving into one about that has more to do with moral influence theory. Not that Jesus died for our sins, but that Jesus was a swell guy and you should be like him. It's kind of like the difference between a celebration of life and a real funeral. It's more marketable. And anyway, I love the character of the Sin Eater. I named mine Argyle because it was the only thing reliably Scottish that I understood, the socks. And because it sounded, as our vocabulary off, it sounds like our guile, our guilt. And I thought that worked out nicely. So the first poem I ever wrote was a 24-line poem. So I wrote 23 more of them my book, The Sin Eater, is made up of 24 24s, all about Argyle and his adventures. Here's the first one, The Sin Eater. Argyle the Sin Eater came the day after, a narrow, hungry man whose laughter and the wicked upturn of his one eyebrow put the local folks in mind of trouble. But still they sent for him and sat him down amid their whispering contempts to make his table near the dead man's middle, and brought him soda bread and bowls of beer and candles which he lit against the reek that rose off that impenitent cadaver, though bound in skins and soaked in rose water. Argyle eased the warm loaf right and left, and down swift gulps of beer and venial sin, then lit into the bread now leavened with the corpse's cardinal mischiefs. Then he said, "6 pence, I'm sorry," and the widow paid him. Argyle took his leave then down the land between hayricks and Frisians with their calves, considering the innocence in all God's manifold creation but for man, and how he'd perish but for sin and mourning. 2 parishes between here and the ocean, a bellyful tonight is what he thought, please God, and breakfast in the morning. So enough of these poems, you'll soon figure out that as a undertaker for 50 years this year, actually, I identified with the ambivalence with which people greeted a sin eater on the premises. They were very glad to see him because he was getting rid of sins. They were very glad to see him gone because he was such a, well, he was like a funeral director. He always had his hand out for compensation. And so that little book, The Sin Eater, 24 24s, many of which appear in this Bone Rosary, was a way of sort of conducting my own business. In maybe I'll read the last one and then I'll finish up with one more poem. This is how it ends for him. He has a jackass which he calls Paraclete. Paraclete Press was the publisher of my Sin Eater poems. I thought it was one way to make it right with him, you know. His Paraclete was a piebald donkey, bequeathed him by a sad-eyed parish priest, whose sins he supped away one Whit Sunday some months in advance of your man's demise. Never a shortage of asses, Argyle. God knows we've all got one of them at least, which truth seemed surplus to requirements. Argyle named the wee jack Recompense and got good orderly direction from it. Wherever the one went, so went the other, bearing mighty nature's burdens wordlessly, the brown sign of the cross across their backs. The last was ever seen of them was headed west, a tatterdemalion and his factotum, making for the coast road in the cold and gloaming, braying and flailing out gestures of blessing over hedgerows and hay bales, man and beast alike, hovel and out office, dung heap and home, everything in eye and earshot rectified, cats pardoned, curs absolved, tethered cattle loosed, and all of vast creation reconciled in one last spasm of forgiveness. As for the Sin Eater and Recompense, where the road turned toward the sea, they turned with it. Well, the parish where all that happens is very near my house in Moveen. And every time I go for a walk around that coast road, I think I'm going to see that ass and his donkey. I want to finish with a poem actually, it's probably what I'd call a failed haiku. As happens, the older we get, someone said the more we write about things we see. I've never had great aptitudes visually, but as if anybody, when I examine my own poems, I see that things I encounter visually make a big difference to me. They always sort of shock me into some sort of talk about them. I started with this poem about Corinne and the fronds of basil. What I didn't tell you is that the photograph, while unremarkable, Corinne's quite remarkable, the basil is quite remarkable, but the photograph isn't great, except that it put me immediately in mind of those paintings of Isabella and the pot of basil we are forever seeing among the pre-Raphaelite painters who were basing their paintings on a poem by Keats, who stole it from a story by Boccaccio centuries before. So the provenance, the bloodline of this poem tries to connect itself to Boccaccio and Keats and Holman Hunt and the rest of those hooligans who were forever painting Isabella or the pot of basil. And I suppose Lorenzo's skull inside the, anyway, you know the story. This is called Ekphraxis. And I should say in advance how grateful I am for you tuning in and outnumbering me. That's always the first level of success. And well, I'm just very grateful for your attention. You could be doing any number of things. So thank you very much. I always say it's like going to the shrink and not getting a bill for it. So thank you. And one of you might want to think up a question or two. So, because otherwise I'll just go on reading poems for the rest of the night. Well, for an hour, then I'll fall asleep. Ekphraxis. I took this photo of Corinne last year and wrote a poem later the same day, which was the day she saved the basil in my garden from the frost she heard was nigh. Her standing in my kitchen holding those greens, the aspects of her, that look of longing, put me in mind of William Holman Hunt's old painting of John Keats's poem called Isabella, or the pot of basil, inside of which the pot, not incidentally, the head of Lorenzo, her murdered lover, is decomposing and hidden from view. So we keep ogling Isabella, her languor and pining, her ample bosom, who has the face of Hunt's departed wife, who died in childbirth some months before he finished this canvas. It's an old story, refashioned by Keats from Boccaccio, the way all poets borrow, great ones steal, according to T.S. Eliot, that thief, or was it Picasso? God only knows. The way one image leads to another, the snapshot, the sudden spark, the seeing that brings something separate into being, the seedling becoming something the seed could never itself have quite imagined, connecting the bits of one creation to bits and pieces of another, the rooting, ramifying urgency that pushes the new thing into the light. The poem that I made that day became one of many in a book of poems called Bone Rosary, a collection of beads by which we keep track of being and ceasing to be, those living mysteries in light of which all we do is sit in silence. My daughter used to call me El Jefe when she was working at the funeral home. Before that saddened panic rose in her, they diagnosed as schizophrenia, kept her estranged from us for 15 years before she took her leave from off the bridge in Marin County, California. The Golden Gate became her sad line's end. My friend Joan painted a portrait of her. I hung it on the bedroom wall upstairs. We gather what we can of brokenness into a place where we might reframe it as restoration of a sort of wholeness in the horrid face of desolation. There's more to this, of course, but mystery wants more than anything, alas, our silence. So back to the photo and the poem. Ekphrasis with a side of illusion, the senses and the imagination free-ranging in the way they take their cues from life's long study and experience. A Colombian poet named Tallulah Flores, which I Englished as Tallulah Flowers, a plural noun or verb, it's hard to know. She asked, would I read some poems for their festival, Poem Rio, featuring poets of the Caribbean? Except for stays in the Lesser Antilles, Cancun and Casa de Campo once, I couldn't figure out why she'd asked me, but chose some poems to do with flowers, with gardening and growing things, with all Montbretia and rhododendrons. So Corinne among the fronds of basil became Corinne entre las hojas de albahaca. And when a visiting theologian spoke the Spanish version of the poem, for she in fact had worked the Caribbean in service of her church, the Anglicans, all the versions of it seemed connected. The mysteries of love and death and silence, the sound, the sense, the sight of timely harvest, the women in my kitchen and my poems, the beauty of their being and their gifts whereby the broken heart is nonetheless still beating out its possibilities. A moment of balm, a tonic, possibly a romance involving flowers, their meaning, trees of knowledge, of good and evil, Romeo, Juliet, Flores and Blanche Fleur, Adam and Eve. I'm living in a Leonard Cohen tune involving a woman and a river, a distant country and the theater, something on canvas cast in bronze or song by which mammals discern the way of mammals. Let us grant that it involves an island, a bridge, a ferry, a water crossing, an open grave, an empty sky, the sun, the moon, the loving body, and ourselves alone. Sometimes the pool of sorrows overflows. Sometimes the shit that happens overwhelms. And still, the unanticipated gift appears. That sudden beneficence beyond imagination. There it is. The moonlight in the bedroom window gives a glimpse of her naked and unabashed, and curling into your embrace with ease as if she came to reckon with your pain, the long years of damage and estrangement, the thankless, luckless, sorry circumstance of being you, yourself in a sore world. And these are surplus to requirements. Her willing body adjacent to yours, her pressing herself onto yourself, an abundance much like grace itself is unearned and undeserved, much the same as creation's favor with its creatures, the fervor of lovers for lovemaking, the reverence for beauty and for being, the texture of longing touch exposes, or liberties taken in smallish doses, a sudden catch of breath, a sudden seeing, or the way that Isabella's weeping never brought Lorenzo back, but greened the basil and beckoned the poets and painters to make something out of such contingencies, the way Corinne could sense the coming frost, a hankering for pasta and pesto sauce, the common table shared, the table talk with fellow palmers or with passers-by, by which we get a sense of the connections, a sense withal that we are not alone in our heartaches, longings, and bereavements, our losses, lack of lucks, the brief achievements we might be with any luck remembered for. I think that's enough of that. Thanks for listening.